Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. In this week's episode, a brief introduction to our horror unit that is going to carry us through the end of October, all the way through to Halloween. I'm talking, of course, about Bram Stoker's immortal 1897 classic, one of the most important, influential, and I'm going to say best books in the Anglophonic canon. I am, of course, talking about Dracula. In this episode, in this brief episode, we're going to sketch the life of Bram Stoker himself. We're going to talk a little bit about the writing of the book and about the book's reception and a little bit about its influence too. And then next week, we're going to begin the reading proper with the first 7 chapters. I'll note that this is the first episode of Stars and Swords, episode 31, if you can believe it. This is the first episode of Stars and Swords that I am broadcasting live on YouTube to my Patreon supporters. Thank you guys for making this possible, first of all. Secondly, I apologize for the slight delay as we were getting started there. This is a very technical thing that I'm having to do while also trying to, record a podcast. So I apologize if there's any inconvenience. I apologize if there are any technical hiccups as we progress. And I apologize mostly that I don't have the YouTube chat right here in front of me this second. I will try and find it when I discreetly shuffle you all over to look at the first slide, which we're going to do in just a moment because we're going to begin by talking about this man, by talking about Bram Stoker, born in Dublin, Ireland in 1847, the third of 7 children. His childhood is defined by a strange, unknown illness. Until the age of 7, he is restricted to his bed, unable to walk or even to stand. During this time, he's entertained with stories by his parents, particularly his mother, who shared with him tales of Irish folklore and myth, and he watches the comings and goings of life on his street. It's certainly possible that this combination of the wry and the dark and the hard grit of daily life in Dublin and presumably the melancholy that his loneliness caused, all of these things contributed to his sensibilities as a writer. At the age of 7, however, his illness has improved to the point where he can be enrolled in school, and he would continue to improve physically to the point that his childhood illness had no bearing on his life later. He was regarded as an accomplished young athlete. At the age of 17, he enrolls in Trinity College, a broad-shouldered, sociable young man, 6'2" in height, the largest, as he says, of his family. Over the course of 6 years, during which time he is supporting himself by working 6 days a week for the Irish Civil Service, he studies for a Bachelor of Arts and then goes on to a Master's. He runs the College Historical Society and he runs the College University Philosophical Society, as well as winning trophies for the shot put, weightlifting, high jumping, long jumping, gymnastics, and perhaps less impressively, but more bewilderingly, race walking. He loves to talk, to debate, to argue, but more than anything, he loves to write. While at Trinity studying for his master's, Stoker meets and becomes friends with another member of the Historical and Philosophical Societies, Oscar Wilde. More about him in a moment. Stoker continues working for the civil service after graduating, heading up a group of clerks working for the Petty Sessions Court in Dublin. He's very successful and begins a radical expansion of the department. In fact, Stoker's first published book is a manual for running that selfsame department. He also begins writing at this time for the Dublin Evening Mail, the newspaper of Dublin, and he's reviewing primarily theatre. His work stands out immediately, even though reviewing theatre is generally looked down upon at that point in history. He begins to attract a lot of attention, not least of all from the famous actor Henry Irving, who is so taken with Stoker's review of his own performance as Hamlet, in Hamlet, that he invites Stoker out for dinner and the two become fast friends and later business partners. They remain pretty close for much of Stoker's life. Oscar Wilde, meanwhile, had fallen in love, somewhat improbably, with a young woman named Florence Anne Lemon Balcom. This is her. He describes her in a letter to a friend as possessing, quote, the most perfectly beautiful face I ever saw. Florence, oddly, had grown up on the same block in Dublin as Bram Stoker, and while we don't know exactly how they met or how they began their romantic relationship, Bram and Florence are married in 1878. Wilde is not happy about it. He's not, wild about it, but he and Stoker repair their relationship years later. The same year as he gets married, Stoker accepts an invitation from Henry Irving to come to London and to act as the business manager for the brand new Lyceum Theatre. The following year, Florence would give birth to the couple's only child, whose first name, appropriately, was Irving. During this time, Stoker plays host to the great and the good of London society. Being the business manager of the Lyceum basically means schmoozing. It's basically a social role. He builds relationships and even friendships with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Alfred Lord Tennyson and William Gladstone, and during his later tours of the United States, with Mark Twain, with Theodore Roosevelt, and with one of his favorite writers, a man he absolutely idolized, Walt Whitman, to whom he had written a fan letter during his time at Trinity. And I say fan letter, but desperate and passionate, if parasocial love letter would in fact be closer to the truth. This is the end of a letter which was sent in 1876, but was written in 1872. Quote, I have been more candid with you, have said more about myself to you than I have said to anyone before. You will not be angry with me if you have read so far. You will not laugh at me for writing this to you. It was no small effort that I began to write, and I feel reluctant to stop, but I must not tire you any more. If you would ever care to have more you can imagine, if you would ever care to have more you can imagine, for you have a great heart, how much pleasure it would be to me to write more to you. How sweet a thing it is for strong, healthy men with a woman's eye and a child's wishes to feel that he can speak to a man who can be, if he wishes, father and brother and wife to his soul. I don't think you will laugh, Walt Whitman, nor despise me, but at all events, I thank you for all the love and sympathy you have given me in common with my kind. End quote. Which I guess draws us inevitably toward the subject of Stoker's sexuality, which honestly isn't terribly interesting, except in that prurient, salacious, gossipy way that some people seek to categorize writers and people with, frankly, any measure of celebrity at all. Certainly, Stoker experienced deep feelings toward the men in his life. It seems very likely that he was bisexual, if not gay, though there's also no indication that he was anything other than a loving and devoted husband to Florence. Though it must be said that there's little to no evidence about the nature of their relationship at all, and some minds inclined to speculation like to take the absence of evidence as the evidence of absence. A lot of this, I should note, comes from the work of David J. Skal, an accomplished film historian, a writer who published over more than a dozen books on the history of monsters and the macabre in Hollywood movies. I haven't read his biography of Stoker, I have skimmed it, but that biography is particularly speculative about Stoker's sexuality, in, I should say, the spirit of positive inquiry and celebration rather than in any kind of, prurient condemnation. But I enjoyed very much Skal's contributions to the Norted Collected Edition on Dracula. It's a really great bound volume, actually, with a lot of great perspectives on the book. And Skal in particular, I think, is a very interesting writer, or was, I should say, a very interesting writer. Skal sadly passed away in January of this year, but left behind a really great contribution, particularly to film history and our understanding of the role of the monster in 20th century film, which is a subject about which I could talk for hours, I promise. Let's also take this opportunity to mark this right now. I am absolutely here for the homoerotic reading of Dracula as text or as subtext. But as I move through the book and as I prepare my notes for our upcoming sessions, I find that there isn't a lot of there, at least not a lot that is uniquely and specifically homosexual, as opposed to just being sexually charged in a less specific way. We'll talk about this as we go, and it's a discussion certainly complicated by the fact that for all of the love that this book gets, and for all of the love that Stoker gets as a writer, which I still think is less than he deserves, honestly, we tend to overlook his absolute mastery of voice. We tend to connect the characters in Dracula with Stoker himself in a way that I think diminishes his skill as a writer and does a lot to occlude his purpose in creating these characters in the first place. More on that, obviously, as we move through the text. In any case, Stoker releases his first novel in 1875. This is The Primrose Path. This is a parable about the dangers of alcohol, originally serialized in Shamrock magazine. Busy with his work at the Lyceum at this point, he doesn't publish a second novel until 1890, the same year that he begins somewhat casually to pin down the story that will become Dracula. The exact writing process is difficult to understand. It's difficult to navigate. It's difficult to distill out from a mass of contradictions, much of which comes from the over 100 pages of handwritten notes that Stoker prepared between 1890 and 1895. I can show you, in fact, here. I can advance the slide by one in order to show you. This is a sample page from his handwritten notes. So he compiles this mass of notes, partly which includes scenes which are basically the same as in the finished manuscript, others which are wildly different. There are characters here that are struck out who never make it to the finished novel. There are characters here who absolutely make it to the finished novel. On this page, you can see, of course, the names Dracula, and you can see Seward, and you can see Jonathan Harker, but also a detective named Cotford, which is... oh, that's a tempting thought, isn't it? If Dracula was more of an outright detective novel, I'm fascinated by the prospect of that. He visits the town of Whitby, which is, of course, so important in the novel, all the way back in 1880, which is where he finds, within the town's public library, the name Dracula. There are werewolf elements to the story. There are more explicit supernatural elements, I suppose, more explicit than we get in any case. There are, as I say, these detective elements and these characters who don't make the cut. These notes, by the way, are now in the care of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So if you're ever nearby Philadelphia, this would be a good place to stop. Much of Dracula is finally written during Stoker's vacations in the small town of Cruden Bay in Scotland, just a little north of Aberdeen, out on the bitter North Sea coast. I would recommend a visit, but honestly, it's a pretty... That stretch between Aberdeen and Peterhead, right in the northeast tip there, is pretty grim. So maybe, if you're going to go in the summer, is what I'm saying. Let's note that at this point, Stoker, of course, does not invent the vampire. He doesn't even really popularize the vampire in English fiction. The Vampire, with a Y, is published in 1819, written by John Polidori, this man that you can see on your screen right here. This man is the uncle by marriage of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his siblings, one of the people, and I should say, he's one of the people present during that fateful night on the shores of Lake Geneva when Mary Shelley begins work on Frankenstein. Indeed, it is Lord Byron's abandoned fragment of a story that he writes that one night that inspires Polidori to write The Vampire shortly thereafter. The word vampire enters the English language almost 100 years before this novel, almost 200 years before Bram Stoker writes his. It's attested from around 1732 in a newspaper account about an epidemic of blood drinkers in Hungary and surrounding countries. It's then, importantly, used in 1774 by the French biologist Buffon to refer to blood-drinking bats in South America. And this is its primary usage in English through the beginning of the 20th century. When people say vampire, for 200 years, they mean exclusively bats. There's a notorious moment in the Silmarillion, in the story of Beren and Luthien, in which Professor Tolkien describes Sauron vanquished in combat by Huan, the Hound of Valinor, as transforming himself into a vampire and fleeing, but it's clear there that he means bat. But if the word is relatively modern, the concept is, of course, ancient. Ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Persia all have their own versions of vampire stories. Creatures that, usually demonic creatures, that consume blood or other kinds of life essence in order to prolong their own existence. Ancient Persia is thought by some to be, in fact, the earliest culture which records myths of beings like vampires. The Ashanti people of West Africa tell of the Azan Bosum, which are very similar, of course. You have the Jiangxi of Chinese folklore, who eat flesh or consume life essence at a distance, foregoing the traditional blood, but they are in many ways similar. And it's fitting that the word enters English because of rumored vampires in Eastern Europe, because that's the tradition that Stoker engages with most directly as he's settling down to write Dracula. This is a story which finds its teeth, if you'll excuse the pun, in Transylvania, a region in the center of modern-day Romania. As Stoker is writing, it is part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but back in the 15th century, it was part of the Wallachia, what the locals call the Terra Romanesca, the domain of Vlad Tepes, known in English, of course. I'll show you his beautiful visage here. Here we go. Known, of course, as Vlad the Impaler. For the centuries before Stoker, Dracula meant Vlad the Impaler. That was the name he used. It was a name which is derived from the name of his father, Dracul, meaning dragon. The A there in the language of the region, it takes the genitive form. So Dracula literally means son of Dracul, the son of the dragon, which is worth thinking about as we consider the significant date near the beginning of the book. Now, we don't need to dwell on the crimes and the cruelty of real-life Vlad Tepes here, but we should emphasize with great care how ignorant the average Victorian reader would have been of the mythology surrounding vampires as we understand it today. As I said, in the Britain of the time, the word meant blood-sucking bats, and that was all. There was no popular consciousness connecting that word to the enduring undead, to none of the tropes that we now all osmotically understand. The average Victorian reader would not have known about garlic and stakes and beheading and coffins and all of the various trappings and accoutrements that we now associate with vampires in so much of our popular culture. Now, a lot of that comes from Stoker. A lot of that is kind of distilled, is codified, is put in place by Stoker in the pages of Dracula. Much of it, of course, is not, and comes along in the long shadows cast by this book over 20th century popular culture, particularly as we move into the era of film, and we need things to be a little more visual, things to be a little more readily understood, a little more readily representative. I will show you this slide here too, if I can find this. This is the map of Transylvania. You can see it right there in the middle of Romania. Transylvania, by the way, is derived from the Latin. It means beyond the forest. Transylvania, right? Beyond the forest. Brilliantly, during the medieval period, it had an even better name, which was Ultrasylvania, which I think is, if you can get your Transylvania to evolve into the next stage, it evolves into Ultrasylvania. It's ghost type primarily, ghost type, psychic type, dark type. It can fight very effectively for you in your local Pokemon gym. You can see here too, kind of by inference here, if you recognize the Republic of Moldova and the Ukraine there at the top, that Transylvania in particular lies in the hook formed by the Carpathian Mountains there. It is relatively secluded. It's kind of bounded on both sides by mountain ranges, in fact. And it has a culture and a history all its own. Its history, in fact, including its actual geographical boundaries, because these things shift readily during the period, is just far too complicated to go into here. But we can kind of draw elements of that history as well as everything else, right? There's this stew pot of mythology and folklore and stories half remembered. We can pull all of this out and fold it into a rich folkloric culture of this part of the world, by which I don't specifically mean Transylvania, and I don't even specifically mean Romania. I mean kind of Eastern Europe, right? Everything on the shore there of the Black Sea, everything in the western shadow of the Caucasus there. It's such a rich and specific cultural heritage, and all of these myriad elements, of course, come together in the creation of Dracula, published in May of 1987, of course, May of 1897 by Archibald Constable and Company in London, who had secured the publication rights to the book only 6 days before they started printing it, which was no time at all even then. It was an immediate critical success. Reviews were favorable. The word of the novel began to spread. Stoker and Irving put on a 4-hour stage version of the story in the Lyceum, though that was only intended to cover copyright rather than really run. And unfortunately, tragically, the script for that production has been lost. It was then serialized in the US newspaper Inter-Ocean, which is published out of Chicago, and that series enticed Doubleday and McClure to purchase the American printing rights for the novel, which were secured in 1899. This, as you can see on your screen, is the first American printing of Dracula. The book was, again, a success, though it's in the US release of the novel that Stoker inadvertently secures, I think, the enduring popularity of our eponymous account, because American copyright law demands that the author register the copyright and provide 2 copies of the book in order to secure that copyright. Stoker, carelessly, provided only a single copy of the book, which means that in the 1930s, when Universal Studios is going through the process of securing the rights to the novel, they discover that it is, in fact, in the public domain. It was never copyrighted in the United States at all. That is why there are so many Dracula movies and stories of all sorts throughout the rest of the 20th century. That's why, in a sense, the word Dracula has become largely synonymous with the vampire. Anyone could use this specific character. Anyone could tap into all of this, both cultural baggage, cultural accumulation, but also, crucially, cultural legitimacy. In 1908, at the age of 58, Bram Stoker suffered the first in a series of strokes. 7 years later, in 1912, 5 days after the HMS Titanic sank into the waters of the North Atlantic, he succumbed to the last. The ambiguity in the reporting of the causes of death have led to a popular myth that Stoker had syphilis. That is, like so much of his life, unconfirmed. Dracula, though, appropriately enough perhaps, lived on. Plays and operas and musicals and 5 Universal movies and 9 Hammer movies and countless other films, including the early gay pornographic movie Dracula and the Boys. He's a canon character in the Marvel comic book universe and in the DC comic book universe. There have been 10 direct TV adaptations of this novel and a genuinely daunting number of TV appearances and references, including, perhaps most inevitably, the somewhat middling opening episode of Season 5 of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Buffy vs. Dracula, which is notoriously the episode which introduces in its final turn, Dawn. Is it the weakest of the Buffy season openings? No, it's probably not. It's probably slap bang in the middle, now that I come to think of it. Buffy, of course, a series that generally ends its seasons much better than it starts them. So Dracula is a phenomenon, and arguably is the most recognizable of those classic, universal horror movie characters, rather. So much of that characterization, for all that Stoker is drawing on this maelstrom of folklore and of myth and of symbology and of thematic representation, of motif and of image, for all that he's drawing on this maelstrom, he really does condense the character down into something which has proved to be, as we've seen here, extremely enduring. But what's perhaps most surprising, what's perhaps most important, is that Stoker's reputation as a writer still isn't what it should be. Dracula is awesome, is incredibly influential, is incredibly important as a pop cultural phenomenon, but the book, I think, remains better than any adaptation. I might have to carefully massage that statement as we move through the book, and I can kind of think more about some of the adaptations that I've seen over the years, but the book stands at least at the very top tier of representations of Dracula. And I mentioned earlier Stoker's mastery of voice, which we can attribute perhaps in part to that lonely childhood given to listening and to hearing the voices of the people around him, and of course to his time in the theater where voice is so important. But that ability is deployed so powerfully and so subtly in the pages of the book that the author seems to disappear completely, or perhaps it's more fair to say that the characters expand to fill the space usually filled by that same author function. And it's odd to think of a book that is this important, that is this influential, that is so well regarded, that is so widely enjoyed, in which the actual prose of the book is as casually dismissed as Dracula. I'm here to tell you that we're going to spend the next 3 weeks, the next 4 weeks even, looking at the text of Dracula, because the text of Dracula is extremely good. It's extremely careful. It's extremely astute. It's extremely thoughtful. It's balanced. It's poised. It's elegant. It's also incredibly punchy and affecting and visceral in moments. It is a brilliantly written book, and I'm really looking forward to getting into the prose of it all. And that really is the end of our episode. I'm going to show you this slide just before we wrap up here. Next week, Monday, October 7th, 8 p.m. Central, we're going to cover the first 7 chapters. That'll carry us through Jonathan Harker's Adventures in Transylvania, a dispiriting and gross intermission with Dr. Seward and with Renfield, our introduction to Lucy and to Mina, and we'll close out with the ill-fated Demeter. As always, thank you guys for joining me live. If you would like to hang out here on YouTube on a Monday night, head on over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge your support for the price of a cup of coffee. You can help me keep making podcasts, and you can get access to bonus episodes for this show and for the now concluded podcast studying the filmography of the last star in Hollywood, Mr. Tom Cruise. I spent the better part of a year watching all of his films and talking about them every week with in the company of the wonderful Elizabeth Ray. And of course, Elizabeth and I will also be producing an upcoming series looking at the timeless and lovely Before trilogy by Richard Linklater, Ethan Hawke, and Julie Delpy. Speaking of which, speaking of bonus episodes, that is, not of the Before trilogy, I will put up a poll next week so that you can all choose what we cover for a bonus episode. It is likely, honestly, cards on the table, it's likely to be Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. But there's a chance, if you, like me, are currently somewhat exhausted by the discourse surrounding Francis Ford Coppola, maybe we'll just pick something else. Maybe we'll just pick something a little happier. Maybe we'll pick a selection of movies so we can gloss them a little bit, and we can talk about those over on the Patreon page. Whether you're watching live or listening to the podcast after the fact, you can find all of that at patreon.com/nextword. And I appreciate your support, because I don't run ads on these shows because ads are a blight. So this is the direct support that I need in order to continue doing this. And that's the show. Next week, chapters 1 to 7. And as always, Can you tell me why men believe in all ages and places that there are some few who live on always if they be permit, that there are men and women who cannot die? Thanks for listening, you guys. Good night.